Welcome back to World War II TV. This is a kind of an oddball show in the sense it's not part of our Attrition Off the Beaches show. It's sort of an exclusive one look at an operation that happened in March 1945. And in case you're wondering why in the middle of the week we're talking about Normandy, we are going back to March 1945 or skipping ahead, if you like, to March 1945, is because that very reason. There were two times of year your average history buff thinks about airborne operations. June, Normandy, 101st Airborne, Dick Winters, British Airborne, Pegasus Bridge, Major Howard, all that. And September, Arnhem, James Gavin, did he go to bridge? Did he take the bridge? Urquhart, did he do wrong? The rest of the year, we kind of don't think about them. And the fact is, the crossing of the Rhine, Operation Varsity, March 1945, was a really, really important and really large-scale airborne operation that just doesn't get enough press. So while we're in the middle of thinking about Normandy and D-Day and all the exciting exploits there, we're just going to have this side show and talk about another operation. And I'm really thrilled to bring you this guest because his book was cracking. I'm holding it up there, 4 Hours of Fury, fantastic read. Former paratrooper, former pathfinder, former jump master. You can't go wrong with this. So joining me tonight from the States, James Fenelon. So how are you doing, James?
I'm doing well, Paul. Thanks for the invitation, and also big thank you to everyone who joined us live. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and as usual, we'll put comments up if there are any questions about the operations there. So before we leap in and talk about Operation Varsity, I just kind of gave it away that you're a former paratrooper yourself, and we know that particularly with airborne and special forces and the US Marines, you understand your history. The same in British paratroopers understand the legacy. But the 17th Airborne, the crossing of the Rhine, it's somehow kind of fallen through the cracks. Everyone knows about Sam Merrick Lee's paratrooper on the church, but this massive great operation, why has it just not really been talked about in the same way we talk about Normandy and Arnhem?
It's an interesting question. So to your point, I mean, when I was growing up, I was familiar with the jumps into D-Day, the Operation Market Garden, a little bit about Sicily and Italy, things like that. But it wasn't really until 1988 when I was going through jump school and I was in the museum there on post that I just saw a little blurb about Operation Varsity. And over the ensuing years, as I spent more time educating myself on airborne history, in particular American airborne history, there was never really a lot about it. And then as I started digging into it, I found that there were a fair amount of misconceptions about the size of the operation, the violence that took place during the operation. And so to answer your question, I think that there are a couple of things that have contributed to it being overlooked, especially perhaps from the American side. As we'll get into, Operation Varsity was largely a British operation under the command of Montgomery. So I think from an American perspective, they've perhaps looked at it as more of a British show and haven't put the rigor into studying or understanding it as much. It also took place at the end of the war, March of 1945, as you mentioned. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around exactly how the war ended. I think some people think the war just kind of petered out. And the reality is, in April, the last full month of the war, the Americans suffered over 10,000 men killed in action, which is roughly the same number of men killed in June of 1944. So the violence was just perpetual right up until the very end of the war. So I think that misconception, though, of what happened at the end probably dissuaded some from digging deeper. And then lastly, the 17th was one of countless divisions that was formed specifically for the war and then was quickly disbanded after the war was completed. And so the legacy of that division, it was never brought back. It didn't have the staying power that the 101st or the 82nd did. And that history was largely then relegated to veterans reunions and small sections and larger volumes about the end of the war.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's two things about that spring period of 45 that I think has come up on previous World War II TV shows. One is, I think the public are kind of getting war boredom in a sense. There's so many operations been coming at them. It's like, oh, another one now. And there's this general feeling amongst the public is that we can kind of take our foot off the gas a little bit. The Germans are broken. The end is in sight now. We've got through the winter. The Russians have nearly pushed the Germans out of everywhere. The circle is closing. Except to counter that is the Germans are now defending their homeland. it's getting desperate, and it's that wounded beast, isn't it? It's a tiger is never more dangerous than when you've shot it once, and that's how we are with the Germans now, is that the grizzly bear has been wounded and now he's defending his own territory, and that's interesting. So I think, we've touched on that with John Russell's show early in the year about the Aller River and the British pushing up across there into Germany. It just gets overlooked after Market Garden. It's like people's interest just seems to tail off, and it's understandable. But Operation Varsity, and we are stressing, folks, as James said, that we're focusing on the American aspect, although contextually we explain the British operation. Perhaps we'll cover the British operations next time, but as usual, James has provided a PowerPoint that we will talk over, and a very professional, slick one it is too, if I may say so. Lovely background. I may be borrowing that for some of my own PowerPoints over the next few weeks, but I'm sure you won't mind. So, this is all about getting into. It's the hurdle of getting into actual Germany proper, isn't it? Since September with Market Garden, it's all about the Rhine. It's all about that final hurdle. We've been talking about how the weather had been generally shit over that winter. The spring, there's flood water everywhere, and the Allied armies have been kind of encircled Germany, almost waiting for the weather to get better, and also waiting for all the supplies and logistics to build up to do that final push. So kind of explain us as we start off, the concept for it. Was it a long planned one like Overlord, or was it a swift planned one like Market Garden?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of both, actually. So one of the lessons learned early on in the war, particularly some of the lessons that they learned from Normandy, was that airborne operations can take a long time to plan. And one of the downsides of that is you've got an army moving east across Europe. They don't want to slow down, right? I mean, we can take your pick of commanders who are in the vanguard there, and none of them are really interested in going slower, right? So them slowing down for the airborne troops to plan, to marshal in their airfields. So they formed the First Allied Airborne Army, which was this, it's kind of a unique command. It was a joint command. So it was, while there was an American general who was in charge of it, his direct executive officer, if you will, second in command, initially was Browning, famous from the Market Garden. But the idea behind the First Allied Airborne Army was that they kind of had a staff who did all these plannings in anticipation of what was going to happen. So I think it was Operation Comet was perhaps the first planning session for what became the jump at Arnhem. So they had a number of these plans in anticipation of how the Allies were moving across Europe. And what they could do is they had done all the air route planning, all the drop zone planning. They would refresh it as they got more intelligence. They would take them off the shelf, dust them off, and update them as necessary based on the scheme of maneuver across Europe. And so the Varsity plan was a variation of the Comet plan that had then moved down into Vessel. Well, actually, I take that back, because Comet was originally going to happen closer to Vessel. Then I think they moved it up river to Arnhem. So this was a plan that they had already started. Montgomery was very keen to use airborne troops as part of his crossing of the Rhine. And that's where he originally requested 3 airborne divisions as part of that mission.
Yeah, and also to just explain, we should cover that the fact over that winter, we now actually have quite a large arsenal of airborne troops behind us now. Where after perhaps Market Garden and the Battle of Bulge came quite quickly after that, we've been feeding in replacements. The training setups in both America and Britain and in Canada have kind of now been producing paratroopers. There's a lot of new people coming through. We've not quite got the shortage of aircraft we had earlier. We've not quite got the shortages of other things. So if you're going to mount a really big air operation, it's probably the best time in the war to do it. We are really powerful now. We were powerful in June 44, but it's gone on a level, isn't it? And that's what we're going to discuss later, of course, just the enormity of this and the ambitiousness of it. And maybe I'm going off and I'm going one of my rabbit holes is that although there was lots of human drama, which you'll be covering and you do cover in your book, there isn't that kind of thing to debate. We get the Arnhem Bridge thing, that kind of gets the historians sitting around their armchairs. Well, if they'd done that, you don't kind of get that with Varsity. Varsity doesn't have that moment to me that you can kind of sit and analyze. If only they'd gone left when they went right. It kind of went. I'm not going to say it went smoothly, but it didn't have those kind of dilemmas in a sense. But anyway, I'm putting words in your head and going down rabbit holes. But I'll let you continue, and I will jump in with my inimitable questions and to interrupt the flow. And when we've got comments from our viewers.
Yeah, no, Paul, it's a great point. I mean, I think one of the themes of Varsity is taking all of that air power, taking all those lessons from the earlier airborne operations, and to a large extent, with some notable exceptions that we'll talk about as we go through. It was a fantastic culmination of all those things. And to your point, it largely went to plan. Now, there's some debate afterwards if it was necessary, and that's a debate that's familiar with all airborne operations, and it's a fair question. But I started with this picture here, just because this was kind of one of my first entrees into Operation Varsity, and I wanted to share it because to me it's one of the most iconic photos of an American airborne trooper, perhaps rivaling the picture of on the Yank magazine of the guy pulling himself up on D-Day into the aircraft, which is also a great one. But this is Jim Conboy. He was a member of the demolition platoon in the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And I've got the 17th Airborne patch up here. Just to your point, Paul, I'm going to be predominantly talking about the 17th Airborne Division. They're one of two divisions, and we'll talk a little bit about the British 6th Airborne Division. This is in no way meant to diminish their fantastic contribution. That just happens to be where I've spent my focus and my energy, and where I wrote my first book about them. I would love to do the same treatment for the 6th Airborne because they're just as fascinating and have an even richer history in some ways than the 17th. But let's keep going and dive into a little bit more about the 17th Airborne Division. So, as many of you know, they were probably already know, they were one of 5 such airborne divisions created by the Americans during World War II. They were the 4th one created after the 82nd, the 101st, the 11th Airborne, who then went to the Pacific Theater, then the 17th Airborne Division. They started off with the same kind of organization structure as all the other divisions, which was 1 parachute infantry regiment and 2 glider infantry regiments. Particularly in Europe, they discovered that was not a robust enough formation, because what was happening was after these guys would jump in, they were expected to hold the same frontage along the front lines as a regular infantry division, of which they were grossly undersized. So an airborne division had organically about 8,400 troops compared to somewhere around 12,000 to 14,000, depending on which unit you're talking about. So what they did was they added an additional parachute infantry regiment. So in the case of the 17th Airborne Division, the 507th, which was previously attached to the 82nd Airborne, transferred over to the 17th not long after they arrived in Europe, which was right in the beginning of September 1944. And then they consolidated at a stage a little later on. They consolidated their 2 glider infantry regiments into a single glider infantry regiment, which became the most lethal regiment in the division because they had heavier weapons that they could bring in by the gliders, and they had more manpower as well. So that was really and you'll see how the planners used the robustness of the glider infantry to their advantage in the planning phase.
Yeah.
Going to the next one, this is just kind of a photo to kind of remind us of who the rank and file were of the 17th Airborne Division. So the airborne divisions kind of had a unique makeup because the troopers came from across the entire geography of the United States. Many of the National Guard divisions that were activated were regionalized and came in from very specific areas, because the airborne troops were on the one hand made up of volunteers to go through jump school and man the parachute regiments. They came from all over the place. These guys on the right here, enjoying their cigarettes, whiskey, and pie, are NCOs from the Glider Infantry Regiment. They were not volunteers, and a lot of those guys were not necessarily thrilled with the idea of being assigned to a glider unit. They didn't get, at the time, extra pay, such as flight pay or jump pay. They didn't get the shiny wings like the paratroopers did, and they weren't really allowed to wear the jump boots. Like you can see on this guy here in the middle picture, these are 2 brothers, the Davis brothers, who served in the 517th Signal Company. And this kind of also represents a unique aspect of the division because Albert there on the right with his jump boots volunteered to go through the division jump school that they had set up themselves in Tennessee at the completion of some maneuvers to encourage more glider guys to go through jump school. And you can tell just by his pose there that he's pretty proud of those boots. And so his brother on the other side there elected to stick with the glider troops and did not go through jump school. So there was a wide mix of folks in the 17th Airborne Division. Now, leading the 17th Airborne Division on our next slide is General Miley. And I'm going to talk a little bit about General Miley because through this process, I really came to admire him quite a bit. And I think he's one of the kind of unsung heroes, certainly from the legacy of the American Airborne.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was 48 years old at the time of Operation Varsity. He had graduated from West Point right after World War I. And to kind of give you an insight into the size of the interwar American Army and how small it was, the only way to really get promoted at that time was if somebody retired in your chain of command, and then you hopefully were well positioned to get bumped up. He spent his first 15 years in the military, he spent as a lieutenant. So that just kind of shows you the career opportunities that were available during that time. But he was well positioned when the Army started to expand in the mid to late 1930s. This picture over here on the left of him grabbing the door and getting ready to jump out shows how early he was involved in the organization of the parachute unit. So that helmet on his head, and if you look at it closely, you can kind of see his ear kind of through the plastic. So what's going on here is that the Army was so desperate for equipment that they were using football helmets for the early paratroopers. And on top of that, they wanted them so quickly, they told the manufacturer to not even bother painting them. So because they didn't want to wait. So, it's a clear helmet. But he was the commander of the Army's first organized unit of paratroopers, the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion. And he was really instrumental in establishing a lot of the traditions that airborne troops still recognize today, right? He was the inspiration behind the idea to get jump wings designed to be worn on the uniform. He actively encouraged and petitioned the War Department to get the approval for his guys to wear their jump boots with their pants tucked in and bloused over the boots. And then he was also kind of became infamous for his other way of kind of inspiring esprit de corps within his troops, which was his fight speeches. And so at Fort Benning, where his unit was stationed when they were a battalion-sized element, they were also there with other troops such as Patton's tanker troops and other elements. Well, Miley, before he would release his guys on a Friday for their weekend pass or their night on the town, he would remind them that come Monday morning, he would rather go pick them up in jail or them come in with black eyes than him have to hear one single story about them running from a fight, or more importantly, letting their buddies down. And so he really inspired this camaraderie through fisticuffs. And it was one of these things that he continued to do all the way up until he became a division commander. And allegedly, when they got to the UK in September, the 17th was involved in such a massive brawl at a London nightclub that the entire division was banned from going on leave in London. Now, I haven't been able to find that documented in any of the archives, so I share it here as an anecdotal story. But what has been verified is that Miley was very fond of his fight talks and encouraging his guys to fight. And despite the trouble that it got him into with other military police units and things like that, his mindset was, I'm training these guys to go to war. I don't really care. I want them to fight. The other thing that was part of this was he knew that the best time to earn your men's respect, and for his senior leaders and the sergeants in his unit, he encouraged them all to lead by example, realizing that once you get to combat, and if you don't have the respect of your men, it's too late to earn it then. And so the time to do it was in training. He always led from the front. He kind of famously broke one of his collarbones when he was the first guy to jump with an experimental load of heavy combat equipment. It turned out it was too heavy. and he came down faster than anticipated, breaking his collarbone. He also was the first guy to jump from an aircraft holding the rifle in both hands, which is questionable wisdom because you've got to be able to pull your reserve parachute. So he was very much in the vanguard of those early airborne techniques and rose through the ranks as the Army expanded and eventually became the commander of the.
And I think it's worth jumping in, reminding ourselves of the mavericks that set up the American Airborne, because the American Airborne, like the Ranger, it's very much an integral, accepted part of the US military now. But then it was new. There were almost people in the Army who wanted it to fail. It was an experiment. They would go, oh, it's never going to work. Even though they'd seen the Germans do stuff, we've got to remember that back then there was this sort of, it was expected to fail. And you look at Howard Johnson, the 501st, and some of these other people, Colonel Sink, for example, the 506th, and other guys in the 504th, 505th. They're kind of mavericks. They're renegades. They've had careers that have stop-start because they don't necessarily follow the rules in that sense. And now we look back and see it differently to how it's seen now. The Airborne is very, very precise and ordered, and but it was an experiment. It was an experiment that might have not worked. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, Paul. And I think that's it's funny when you look back, comparing current almost zero tolerance military mindset now versus back then, where these guys were getting in fights all the time, sometimes with each other, definitely with MPs, sometimes with civilians. There's no way that would be tolerated today, and it isn't tolerated today. But that's definitely the mindset. I like the word maverick. I'll trade you the background of the PowerPoint for stealing the word maverick going forward.
And by the way, I should say, my favorite airborne patch, I think, is the 17th Airborne Golden Talons. I think as cool looking patches go, I think it's my favorite. I think. Yeah,
it's sharp. It's sharp. The 101st is hard to beat, but yeah, the 17th is great. Yeah. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a quick map, just to kind of, and Paul touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but as the Allies were kind of pushing their way out of Normandy, heading east, the 17th first entered combat as part of the Battle of the Bulge. So they came over just before Christmas of 1944, and their baptism of fire occurred as part of Patton's army as he was attacking out of the Bastogne area, right? So we're all probably familiar with Patton's tanks rushing towards Bastogne to join the 101st Airborne there. When he attacked out of Bastogne to push back against the German advances, the 17th was on his left flank. Now, part of what happened there was that the 17th was rushed into the line, and their entree into combat was anything but elegant. They arrived on the line piecemeal, meaning that the units weren't all arriving at their line of departure at the same time. The intelligence briefings that they had been given led them to believe that they were going to be chasing the Germans as they were fleeing. And what happened was, as they departed their line of departure, they ran straight into a counterattacking unit of Panzer Grenadiers. It was an extremely violent fight, and the 17th Airborne ended up losing, all told, throughout their time in the Battle of the Bulge, about 4,000 casualties to the enemy, obviously, and also to a significant portion to the weather as well, right? Which we can't discount. So it was about mid-February when they were pulled back out of the line. And the one exception to their combat experience, if you go to the next slide, was the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, right? So we talked a little bit about them. They had obviously jumped into Normandy. They were attached to the 17th Airborne before they came over to the continent for the Battle of the Bulge. And they were commanded by this guy on the left, Colonel Edson Raff. There you go. Edson Raff. His nickname was Little Caesar. He had taken command of the 507th in the middle of Normandy, or early in the Normandy campaign. Paul can help us out with that one.
I forget which day, but yeah, third week of June or something. Yeah.
Pretty early in there. He was a very divisive character, right? So my research has led me to believe that there was no real gray area with him. People either loved him or hated him. and he was comfortable with either one. He came in to one of the things that the 507th, first of all, didn't appreciate was that he was kind of considered an outsider. So when the first commander of the 507th was captured in Normandy, they expected that his replacement would be the regimental executive officer as opposed to Colonel Raff, who came from outside of the unit. He had a distinguished career. He had led America's first combat jump into North Africa, had fought through that campaign, had been personally promoted by Eisenhower to full bird colonel, who had pinned his wings on his full bird wings in North Africa. And he came with a very established set of attitudes. And he believed that battles were won at the platoon and company level. And so he really spent a lot of time down in the weeds, so to speak, with his junior platoon leaders and his company commanders, because that's where he felt the sharpest edge of the regiment needed to be honed. He didn't win himself any fans with the 507th. When they went back to England after Normandy, he instituted a regimen of back to basics training, if you will, where it was back to fire and maneuver, a lot of physical training, a lot of rucksack marching, things like that. That frankly, the veterans of Normandy had felt that they had earned their way out of that stuff. They had felt that their performance and participation in Normandy, that they shouldn't have to train as hard anymore after that experience. And Raff was adamant that not only did they need to train that hard for future conflicts, obviously, but also to integrate the replacements that they got after that. In the Battle of the Bulge, all that training paid off, and he earned a few begrudging converts as part of that, because the 507th fought with the most distinction out of the other regiments in the 17th Airborne. But when they pulled back, and they pulled back into rest camps in the Chalon area, which is east of Paris by a couple hundred miles. And they were in various camps. And like I said, they had suffered around 4,000 casualties. And so to get the division back up to strength, they started integrating replacements. Some guys were coming back from the hospital, but the vast majority of those replacements were newbies coming in from replacement depots in Europe. And the integration of those replacements fell on the shoulders of junior leaders such as John Chester here in the middle, who was an NCO with the 466th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. Now, John Chester was an interesting guy, and the reason he had to train replacements was because he, as an artillery crew chief, was a big fan of teamwork. And so he would constantly drill his artillery crew to such a high fevered pitch of training that the commander of the battalion was constantly cherry picking guys, taking them away from John to distribute the wealth of knowledge across the battalion. So John was in a constant state of training new guys, which was kind of his thing. He self-described himself as an artillery guru. He loved his 75 millimeter howitzer piece and had all his men be able to take it apart and put it back together again by themselves and place it into action. On the far side over here is Frank Dillon, who was a lieutenant, platoon leader in the Glider Infantry Regiment. He had a replacement challenge of a different sort. So his platoon had come out of the Battle of the Bulge with only 8 men still standing. So his platoon virtually was made up almost entirely of replacements. And so he was running his replacements through basic drills, fire maneuver, squad level activities to kind of get them integrated and up to speed. So now, while this was all happening, of course, Montgomery and the Allies were still continuing to push across Europe towards the Rhine River. Now, the Rhine averages, I think, around 400 yards wide. And the Americans on the southern flank and the British and Canadians on the northern flank had a somewhat different mindset as to the way that they were trying to approach the Rhine. And I think that could best be summarized as the Americans were really trying to rush the Rhine River, if you will, trying to catch a bridge on the fly, so to speak, meaning that they wanted to harry the Germans so quickly that they got to the shores of the Rhine before they could blow a bridge, so they'd have an easier way to get across the Rhine. And of course, that happened most famously at the bridge at Remagen. Now, the challenge is the terrain on the far side of the Rhine from Remagen does not facilitate a breakout across Europe that the Allies had planned originally. And that was more conducive in the area north of the Rhine, closer to Wesel, where Montgomery's 21 Army Group was advancing. And so Montgomery's 21 Army Group approached the Rhine. They did not get a bridge on the fly. They ground to a halt after launching Operation Veritable and Operation Grenade to kind of chase the last remaining Germans across the Rhine. And it was as part of that operation that then Montgomery requested 3 airborne divisions to drop on the other side of Wesel. His plan was to cross the Rhine River and then envelop the Ruhr industrial area. And it was in the Ruhr where the Germans still had all of their industrial capabilities. So they were still cranking out self-propelled guns, tanks, even U-boats this late in the war from factories in the industrial complex in the Ruhr. So the main Allied plan was to cross the Rhine, envelop that area, cut off all of that industrial might to then ease their way into the rest of Germany, so to speak.
Cool.
And so during this time, General Miley knew that his unit had been tapped for the airborne drop as part of Montgomery's plan. The rank and file were unaware of that. So Miley had gotten what they call a warning order, which was basically prepare your division for an airborne operation on a date and time to be specified. So the headquarters staff knew that this was happening. The general, guy in formation did not, but they did know that they were training and increasing the tempo of that training to include airborne operations, which they hadn't really done since they had been in England. And so they started doing glider operations, parachute operations to get air crews re-familiar with the process. And I chose this picture to share because it's a cool, rare color photo from the war, which is always great to see. This is the 513th conducting a practice jump sometime in early March of 1945. And it's notable for a couple of reasons. Some of you may have picked out the aircraft in the back are not C-47s. Those are C-46s, which are almost twice as large as a C-47. So they could hold almost a full platoon of fully equipped, combat-equipped paratroopers. Had double doors out the back, which was an important innovation because that allowed the guys to exit faster. If you can exit faster, that means you're going to land closer together. If you can land closer together, that means you're going to assemble faster. If you can assemble faster, that means you can go after your objective faster. So it had a tremendous advantage for the number of troops it could carry and the shortened amount of time it could take to deliver them. Having said that, though, the guys were not really thrilled with being chosen to jump out of C-46s. At this time, they just thought it was for training. But nobody really liked the idea of that door on the opposite side of what they were used to. So C-47 has one door.
Yep.
Nobody wanted to be the guy going out the opposite door. They had been training since they'd been back in the United States. They all had that muscle memory of taking a right turn as they went out the door instead of a left turn, which got the guys, some people can be very, what's the word? If you got a rabbit's foot, it's superstitious.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's it, right?
I can think it, but I can't say it.
Yeah. And so what they did was they actually backed up cargo trucks to each door while the plane was on the ground and allowed guys to practice as many times as they wanted going out the door and jumping into the back of those trucks. The other interesting part of this photo is the new parachute harnesses that these guys are wearing. So you can kind of see it on the guy in the bottom corner over there propped up on his elbow. You can kind of get a good view of that single point release harness. This was, of course, based on the British design. The Americans adopted it after a number of tragedies in Normandy, right, where we're all familiar with the guys landing in the marshes and sadly drowning to death. The Americans had a 3-point harness, one across the chest and 2 across the lower hip. And so they moved to this British system of what we called in the Army the dial of death. But it was basically like you turn it and punch it and it released your parachute harness, which was a great advantage when you were coming down under fire and wanted to get out of your harness quickly. Again, these guys were paranoid that they didn't really have a lot of time to train with it. And certainly on the day of Varsity, a lot of guys ended up cutting themselves with their fighting knives out of the harness simply because they'd forgotten that they were in this new parachute harness and adrenaline being what it is and being shot at. They couldn't find the parachute clips where they thought they were, so they just started cutting them out until they.
There's an interesting point there, because it's something can be better, but if you're not as well trained with it, it ends up being worse, isn't it? It's the second division in Normandy with the Springfield rifle, because it was kind of too late in some cases to bring in the M1, so they went in with the rifle they were used to, which was an inferior weapon. But if you've been spending your time on it, it becomes a superior weapon. And yeah, like the aircraft is an improvement to parachuting in the broad sense, but maybe a disadvantage to the individual paratroopers who've got used to something. It's a paradox almost.
That's right. That's absolutely right. That's a great point. But it wasn't all training. These next couple photos I shared are kind of some of the funner photos. Marlene Dietrich visited the 17th Airborne while they were in their rest camps in France. And then also, I always have to include this photo of these 3 507th Parachute infantry guys. I believe this is in front of Notre Dame in Paris. They're clearly having a good time. The guy in the middle's got an empty wine bottle. The tall guy's clearly caring for his. But I think the photo can be summed up by looking at the woman in the background who's kind of looking incredulously over her shoulder at what is invariably a group of drunk, loud American paratroopers in France. So you can say that we started the stereotypical loud American early on.
Yeah, you've cornered the market, I think, in that now. You're good at it. Yeah, you should don't let it drop now. Yeah.
That's right. So, but of course, the fun had to end at some point, and so around March 20th, the 17th Airborne Division and the 6th Airborne Division in England were moved from their bases to isolated airfields to begin their planning. And by isolated, I just mean that they were no one was allowed on and no one was allowed off once these guys got into their airfields, and they began a robust planning of a series of planning exercises. One of the things I forgot to mention way early on of that cool picture of that American airborne trooper was that picture was taken by Robert Capa, who was a combat photographer, famous for his photos in life. And this one, this one here, this one was taken. So Robert Capa was embedded with the 513th and jumped with them into Operation Varsity. And that photo that we were just looking at with all the guys with the mohawks in their planning session was another Robert Capa photo that he took. And we'll see some more of his photos as we go into the day of the operation. So while the British 6th Airborne is conducting their planning in England, the American 17th is doing the same thing in airfields in France. And so we can look here and we can kind of see this was the plan with the Americans landing on the southern aspect of the bridgehead and the British 6th Airborne in and around the village of Hamilton to the north. They were coming into 2 drop zones and 4 landing zones for their gliders. The Americans had 2 drop zones and 2 landing zones. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize here while we've got this map in front of us is that probably the biggest and most important objectives for Operation Varsity were the bridges over the Issel River. So the Americans had 10 in their sector, and the British had 3 in theirs. And you can see that landing zone S here is kind of tucked into that corner of the canal and the river. And this is, again, where the glider troops came into play. The advantage of landing in a glider, of course, is that your squad is all together in one spot. You can theoretically organize and assemble quicker. And so the objective of seizing these bridges was given to the glider troops, both true in the case of the British and the American Airborne divisions. These bridges were important for two reasons. One, the Germans had placed their armored reserve further northeast because, they knew that Montgomery was about to cross the Rhine. They weren't necessarily 100% confident where he was going to cross the Rhine. So they had pulled their reserves back a bit. So they had the flexibility of knowing, okay, well, once we identify Montgomery's main effort, then we can, commit our reserves. You don't want to prematurely commit them. So by seizing these bridges and holding them and blocking them was going to prevent the German armor from coming into the developing bridgehead down along the Rhine River.
Yeah.
Now, the second reason they were important was because Montgomery wanted these bridges intact to be able to attack out of the bridgehead. And so this was one of the things that I found has typically been overlooked as part of Operation Varsity. And the main argument has always come down to about the depth that the drop had created compared to other areas of advancement across the Rhine. The real objective, and Miles Dempsey, who worked for Montgomery, really wanted these bridges seized, and that's exactly what the airborne troops were tasked with.
Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning at this point, James, because I think one of the reasons why the crossing of the Rhine doesn't get the attention is it seems somehow, I'm going to quote unquote, easier because it seems to just be the Rhine River. But I think mentally we need to think of the Rhine River as being exactly the same as the English Channel on D-Day. And it's an amphibious landing, essentially. It's exactly the same thing. But because we say it's just a river, but it might as well be 40 miles wide. It's about getting that bridgehead and defending that bridgehead. And so you're talking about Varsity, but you are also talking about Normandy. Get across this hurdle and then defend bridges against a counterattack. That's exactly what D-Day plan is. And I think it's important to kind of make that comparison there. And you can see, I think, also the progression of the choice of drop zones and landing zones. Because there's some debate about the ones in Normandy not being perhaps in the right locations. Mm-hmm. They've really chosen some, because they've got themselves like that kind of pocket. They've got the Rhine. By holding those bridges, you're buying yourself some time. Because
absolutely, I think you're right. Great point.
Until it gets resupplied, isn't it? You've got to hold that or hold on until relieved, to use a Major Howard from Longest Day quote. And right. So it's important to kind of to talk about this. It's just exactly the same as D-Day. Just think of the Rhine River as being an ocean, and then I think that helps your understanding of the importance of this operation.
Yeah, that's right. And as a matter of fact, Montgomery had an admiral in charge of the landing craft to get across the Rhine River. I mean, they were moving, to your point, Paul, 5 divisions across the Rhine River, and you had to use boats to do that. And there was actually a admiral in charge of all that. So it's absolutely on the same scale and very much similar to the same plan.
So Craig Tomlinson is watching. His uncle was in the 79th Infantry crossing the Rhine by rubber boat. So rubber boat landing craft is exactly the same thing. It's an amphibious operation into a new country, essentially.
That's right.
Right, we're moving on.
Yeah, let's move on. So one of the things I'm so thrilled that Paul invited me to participate in present to this great community that you guys have built here was I can go a little deep on something that I think you all would appreciate. So some of the interesting aspects, but smaller components of Operation Varsity was the inclusion of OSS agents as part of the drop. This picture up top of this group photo here is Team Algonquin. They were an OSS team led by this gentleman in the middle who's wearing a tie, Captain Vince Aguera. And his idea that he wanted to experiment with was the idea of inserting agents into a foreign country during the pandemonium of an airborne operation. And so he had participated in a market garden and came up with this idea, wrote a memo to the OSS chain of command and said, hey, I think, the next time we do a big airborne op, we should use it as a way to sneak agents into and behind enemy lines. And so a number of these guys in the photo, there's a couple of French agents in there. There's a couple of Belgian agents. There's one Luxembourger. Those two guys these two guys here were Team S&S. So that on the left is Helmut Steltermann and Robert Staub. So these were two American OSS agents who dressed up as Germans and using a captured Kubelwagen, they went into Germany as part of Operation Varsity. They were in the back of a glider with their Kubelwagen. They had boarded the glider wearing overalls to cover their German uniforms, had stripped those coveralls off, and were going into Germany like this. The idea being that the glider pilot was briefed to get them over into a corner of the landing zone as close to the wood line as possible. They would pop open the glider and skedaddle off the drop zone before they started getting shot at by their own guys, with the idea of mixing in with German units. And they had a modified radio in the back of their Kubelwagen, and they were to report back tactical intelligence.
And interesting, James, to jump in here, is that in the Ardennes, when the Germans did this, the Allies go, it's despicable, how cheating at war. but it's okay if we do it. It's Victor's write the history. Oh no, we're doing it. No, it's fine if we're doing it, but no, if they're doing it, it's unsporting. Yeah, I like the double standards we willingly have because we are the victors. Oh no, we can definitely do it because we're doing it for the cause of freedom, which I suppose is a valid point. But it is interesting.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting aspect of the mission, and those guys certainly knew the risks that they were signing up for. As you well know, Hitler's commando order was
orders come up on so many World War II TV shows, and it's actually building up in its intensity because of the terror bombing, as the Germans call it. You're right in that spring of this is the same time for you were watching Strategic Bombing Week on World War II TV a few weeks ago, folks. This is when things like the firebombing of Dresden is happening. There's no love lost for any allies found on their own behind the lines. If you're dressed up as a German, you turn out to be Jewish, then you're it's not a good outcome. Again, it's the wounded beast thing. Is the Germans are getting more and more revengeful as they are losing their grip. So it's not a good time to be behind the lines, whether you're a pilot bailing out of a B-17 or in this case an OSS operative. It's a risky undertaking and very brave people. That's right.
So the other interesting aspect of this was, I think this is a story most of us are familiar with, but Lewis Nixon from the famous Band of Brothers there on the right, jumped into Operation Varsity as an observer for the 101st. And this was an aspect of my research that I wasn't really able to get as far along as I really wanted to. So I've included this other picture here. You can see the left shoulder patch of this guy standing on the right. He's obviously got the Screaming Eagle there. This photo was taken in the airfield. This guy on the left is James Coots. He's the commander of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment. These guys are in their cantonment area preparing for the jump. So obviously there was another 101st Airborne guy who may or may not have jumped with the 513th. Nixon jumped with the 507th. I do know there's another guy I found in Easy Company by the name of Richard Wright who jumped into Varsity. Yep. I don't know if he jumped. I didn't find him on the 507th roster. I don't know if Wright was a sergeant. Maybe this is his picture in this camp here. I don't know, to be honest with you. But
Joe Machia, who was watching up, he's had to go back to work. He will know because he knew Richard Wright. So we may be able to solve that mystery later. I always heard there were like half a dozen 101st guys who qualified for that jump. Yeah, because it's an extraordinary thing is that you could have gone through the entire war in the 101st Airborne. Only ever done, two jumps was Normandy or if you're a glider rider. But yeah, Nixon got 3.
Yeah,
interesting stuff.
Yeah, so there's more stories to uncover. So of course, while these guys are planning, the Germans were not sitting idle on the far side of the Rhine. The Germans on opposite Montgomery and his sector were under the command of this guy here. General Alfred Schlemm. He was 51 years old and a very experienced soldier. He had fought in World War I. He became a military aviator between the wars. He was on the staff of General Kurt Student and was one of the planners of the Crete operation, the invasion of Crete in 1941. And with all that experience, he obviously knew a lot about combating airborne troops. So from his own experience in Crete, he realized that airborne troops are at their most vulnerable when they're landing and they're trying to get their equipment together and they're trying to assemble. And the Germans pretty much took it for granted that Montgomery was going to use airborne troops as part of his drop. Schlemm also benefited from the fact that he had in his possession a stolen copy of the after-action report from Operation Market Garden. And so one of the big lessons learned from that, of course, was don't drop your troops so far out there that you can't get to them in time. And so he felt that his intuition led him to believe that the Allies were going to drop airborne troops closer to the banks of the Rhine. And he started setting up what he did have, which was lots of anti-aircraft guns and lots of machine guns. So while Germany was struggling through numerous factors, manpower, gasoline, things like that, one of the things they were not short of was anti-aircraft guns and squad automatic weapons. And so many of the houses in the Varsity area were fortified, some of them with up to 5 MG-42s in them. So they were just little mini fortresses all around the area. The other aspect here that he made sure was that the anti-aircraft guns were not only well positioned to engage any aircraft coming over the Rhine, but were positioned such that they could be lowered horizontally to engage troops once they were on the drop zone. Joseph Goebbels was also in full swing at this time, of course, trying to stir the population up to the People's War. These guys down here in the middle are the Volkssturm, which of course were guys generally too old to serve in the regular army. And Schlemm did have several battalions of Volkssturm, which he wasn't really thrilled about because he knew that they weren't trained well enough to repel anybody coming across the Rhine. But what he did was he used the Volkssturm to relieve rear area units and then bring those rear area units, who at least were regular soldiers, up to the front as a way to kind of, distribute the labor, if you will. Now, one of the things that Joseph Goebbels did from a propaganda perspective that had a direct hit on the 17th Airborne was on the night of March 23rd, 1945, as these guys are in their airfields preparing to leave the next day, they're listening to propaganda radio, right? Axis Sally. And they hear over the radio, Axis Sally welcome and address the 17th Airborne Division by name. Welcome to the 17th Airborne Division. We're glad you're coming to Germany. Tomorrow morning, you can leave your parachutes at home because the flak is going to be so heavy that you'll be able to walk down without them, right? And so this next photo, I think, really captures an aspect of what these guys were thinking, right? So this is a trooper of the 513th waiting to take off on the morning of March 24th. And you can just tell by the look on his face, right? This guy's probably 20 years old, tough paratrooper, right? Who's been taught his entire professional military career that the advantage of surprise is the thing that paratroopers always have going for them. And now the 17th has discovered what the Allied High Command had already known. So back on March 18th, Enigma had intercepted transmissions from to Alfred Schlemm and his units along the Rhine, telling them that they should expect an airborne operation in their sector anytime. So not only is Axis Sally poking at them, trying to ruin their morale, but she's actually correct in that the Germans have figured out, probably due to a number of factors, not the least of which was utilizing the 12 airfields in France, stuffing them filled with transports and gliders was a very hard thing to hide from aerial reconnaissance, agents that are still operating in France. There's any number of reasons that the secret was let out of the bag. But it was let out of the bag, and these guys left the next morning, flying into the Rhine. And so here's kind of an aerial overview. You've got the 11 airfields in the UK. You've got the 12 airfields in France, of again where the 6th Airborne's coming in to meet the 17th Airborne. The Armada came together outside of Brussels, southeast of Brussels, over this codenamed area Marfak. And this is where the largest armada of the war came into play. So as Paul mentioned at the top of the show, this really was the culmination of Allied air power, right? So before, many airborne operations were curtailed or reduced in size, if you will, because of the lack of aircraft to get an entire lift, right? We're all familiar with Operation Market Guard and the multiple serials that needed to come in. So the Air Armada for Operation Varsity consisted of almost 1,600 troop transport aircraft. That was both to drop troops and to pull gliders. There was almost 1,400 gliders, and these include the American gliders and the British Horsa and Hamilcar gliders. They were protected by almost 500 fighter aircraft, both from the RAF and from the American Air Force. And then bringing up the rear on all of that was 240 B-24 bombers. And these bombers were rigged with supplies. The idea being that, again, one, the Allies wanted to drop these guys all in a single lift to avoid what happened in Market Garden. Doing that meant that they needed to find other aircraft to bring in supplies, right? Because virtually every single C-47 and C-46 was used to bring in troops or tow gliders. So they tapped the B-24 units to come in and deliver supplies right on the tail of the Air Armada. They were bringing in extra ammunition, medical supplies, commo wire, you name it. It was coming in on.
And that's an incredible demonstration of how we've developed and learned and progressed. To have that kind of backup, what people would have given to have that in June 44.
That's right. That's right. And so if you were standing at Marfak when the Armada went overhead and you were standing there when the first plane came over, you would have been standing there for more than 3 hours before the last B-24 went overhead. Was so how big the Armada was, right? Just to kind of give you some idea there.
It's insane. And we've got some footage we're going to talk over here, which James kindly provided. It's just silent, so James will carry on talking. And if anything comes up in the footage that James wants to comment on, we can do that. But we'll just keep on talking about this operation, basically. And hopefully you're enjoying it. I'm sure people are enjoying it. They're saying they are, so that's good.
Yeah, so one of the other interesting, unique aspects about Varsity to kind of contemplate is this idea that it was an invasion, not a liberation, right? So all airborne operations up to this point certainly were taking place in enemy-held territory, but by and large, the populations of those areas were going to welcome airborne troops as liberators. They knew what they were there to do. They were there to kick the Germans out. This operation was going to take place in Germany, and that kind of started a whole bunch of the rumor mill, if you will, amongst the troops around are we going to get pitchforked by German farmers as we're landing in a tree trying to get our harness? Are we going to get shot at by, old guys with shotguns? Are the Germans going to use nerve gas? There was, that was even a rumor. Upper Allied command was concerned about potentially the Germans were going to use gas. So that was an interesting aspect of the invasion or of this mission rather, that hadn't really been done before, right? Hadn't had to be worried about so far, which was the civilian population's reaction, especially given all the stuff that Goebbels had been whipping up, right? This is around the same kind of time as all the rumors about the werewolves and the guerrilla movement and all that stuff. And of course, we know now that the werewolves was largely completely non-existent. And but again, when you're a GI getting ready,
I think reinforces the point there, James, about the general public considering this a part of the war where it's a foregone conclusion and there's not much of a threat. And these guys were as terrified, if not more terrified than the jumpers before June the 6th or the jumpers before Market Garden. It's just because we can now see on the timeline that the end of the war is barely 7 weeks away. They didn't know that then. It seems to be like the final act. But it was high risk, and people were very scared, and it's important to get across the risk of it and what it meant to these individuals as well. The photo of that guy looking frankly terrified I've never really noticed it before. I knew that photo, but I never really looked at his eyes before. He looks like he's scared shitless. And,
I think it's a great point, and it's important to one of the things that these guys kept seeing while they were doing their preparation was every morning intelligence guys would come in and put new information on their maps, right? So they would post, red dots or red pins where they were seeing anti-aircraft positions, right? And so these guys, I remember interviewing one 513th veteran in particular. Every morning they went in to look at their maps while they were in those airfields. The number of red dots kept growing, and so it became very clear to them, like, hey, somebody knows something's getting ready to happen there. And so, it was terrifying. I think when you think, how can you not take that very personally when the area you're getting ready to go is filled with not only soldiers who want to kill you, but obviously potentially civilians. Now, the footage I want to call out here real quick that's interesting to watch as we're seeing this overloaded glider being towed off the runway. If you look, you'll see that they're actually using double tow, meaning that the troop transports here are pulling two gliders, which was the first time this had been done in Europe. Could really only have been done probably in a daylight drop, because trying to do nighttime double tow gliders probably would have been a recipe for disaster because they would have drifted into each other. But using double tow really gave the 17th Airborne Division literally twice the lift, right? So I think they had something like 906 gliders on double tow, which was able to then almost bring in the entirety of the 194th glider infantry regiment, right? So they were really coming in strong through this use of double tow. The British couldn't leverage double tow just because the Horsa glider is so much bigger than the Waco gliders you see here, that there wasn't a troop transport big enough to be able to tow two of them.
And we had a lot of Hammerclahs as well, with bringing the Tetrarch and Locust tanks. I mean, I know that we said we'll tackle a 6th Airborne in a separate show, but there was a lot of armor we brought in, and armored cars and anti-tankers. Again, building on our experience of previous air operations of not having enough artillery, not having enough, of the support.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Because the Americans had nothing like that to bring in any armor. So flying in first was the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and standing in the door of the lead aircraft was Edson Raff. So he, like I said, he was the first guy to jump into North Africa, and now he's going to be the first guy to jump into Germany. He was leading his regiment from the front. The pilot of his craft, interestingly enough, was a guy named Joel Crouch. I think I'm saying that right, who was also a Pathfinder pilot into Normandy.
Famous, very famous, yeah.
Yeah. He and Raff had a bet that he would drop the regiment right on the dime, and the bet was a case of champagne. What he didn't take into account was that Montgomery had this massive smoke screen across the Rhine to frustrate German observers, artillery observers on the other side. Well, that smoke all drifted inland into Germany, obscuring a lot of the landmarks. So the 1st battalion came in the lead, and they dropped about 1.5 miles to the northwest of where they were supposed to. And upon landing, Raff was disgusted to learn that he had just won a case of champagne. He would much rather have landed on his drop zone. But the other two serials coming in with the 2nd Battalion, the 3rd Battalion, and the 464th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion all landed on Drop Zone W as they were supposed to. Now, this is where one of the things that made Raff unpopular actually came into play here. So one of Raff's things that he made his guys do was jump with their heavy machine guns and jump with their radio equipment, rather than putting those on bundles underneath the C-47s. Because these guys jumped with their radios and they understood quickly that they had been separated from the main element, Raff was actually able to reorganize his units on the fly, so to speak. So originally the 1st Battalion was supposed to go into reserve. The 2nd Battalion was supposed to attack Deersport Castle. He was able to get on the radio, change the 1st Battalion's plan to attack Deersport Castle until the 2nd Battalion got there and relieved that. This picture on the bottom right is a World War II era postcard of Deersport Castle, just so you get a better sense of what it looked like. There was a moat around it that you can't really see in that photo. That tower in the middle was the scene of a siege, as a number of German holdouts retreated up into that tower and stayed in there for the majority of the day, until finally a private in the 507th got tired of the standoff, ran up and threw a white phosphorus grenade inside, and they all came running out. But there was a heavy firefight in the Deersport forest and in the Deersport Castle there. The picture in the top right is of General Miley. You can kind of just make out the 2 stars on his shoulder there. That's him right off to the side of Drop Zone W. He jumped in as part of the 2nd serial, right behind Raff's 2nd Battalion. The flak at this point wasn't too bad. So Montgomery had set up a massive artillery barrage that had been going on the night before. One of the things I forgot to mention was that Operation Plunder, the actual crossing of the Rhine, had started the night before. So on the night of March 23rd, 5 divisions started pushing their way across the Rhine, and it was at 10 a.m. on March 24th that these guys jumped in. So right before the aircraft started coming in, that artillery barrage stopped. And so the 1st serial, both for the 6th Airborne and for the 17th, enjoyed kind of that recovery time, if you will, while the Germans were still scrambling to come out of their shelters and get back on their guns. And only one C-47 from Raff's serial was shot down. That would not be the case on the following serials, unfortunately. So coming in right behind them was the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment. They were going into Drop Zone X. They too suffered from obscured landmarks. And so basically the entirety of the 513th Airborne landed in the British sector to the west of Hamilton. Meanwhile, on Drop Zone X, John Chester and the entirety of the 466th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion landed in the drop zone. They were, of course, expecting the infantry to already be there, to have secured the drop zone. So the artillerymen spent their morning fighting as infantry, pushing the Germans back off the drop zone, trying to give them enough elbow room and enough time to assemble their 75 millimeter howitzers, which once they started assembling them, they were essentially using them in the direct fire capacity of just shooting directly into machine gun nests and houses and things like that. The 513th up north, this is a great picture here by Robert Kappa. Again, a lot of these guys didn't realize they were in the wrong drop zone until Horsa gliders started swooping in out of that mist. So the terrain where they landed was very similar to the terrain they had studied where they thought they were. And so it wasn't until these monsters started swooping in silently. I think it's important to remember when you look at this picture, like the thought of this, you look over your shoulder and there's this thing coming across the drop zone, right? They're huge and they're quiet. And so the mist drop of the 513th actually had a couple of advantages. One, because that's where they landed, the Germans now had a choice between shooting at the Americans on the ground or shooting at the Horsa gliders coming in from the sky. Unfortunately, what happened was the Americans, the paratroopers here, swarmed in and took out a lot of the anti-aircraft guns as the horses were coming in, and probably prevented a significant amount of casualties because originally the original plan was that the drop zone was not going to be secured when those gliders came in. And then behind all of that was the glider infantry coming into LZS. And again, these were the 194th glider guys who were coming in to seize their bridges. The flak really had started to pick up at this point. The first two transports pulling in gliders got shot down, meaning that the 4 first gliders had to cut loose early. This started a chain reaction on the follow-on serials, in that tug aircraft started to have to pull up in order to avoid planes in front of them, which meant that as the Armada got further back, it got higher and higher, which meant that the gliders had to cut loose at a higher altitude than they wanted to. And of course, there was also, again, the smoke was on the ground for them as well, which prevented a lot of identification of obstacles and things of this nature. They landed, moved out to seize their bridges, and I know we're pushing on time here, so I'll try to.
No, it's fine. It's great. Don't worry. Keep going.
Okay.
Don't worry.
And so the fighting here really focused for the bridges 1 and 2 and bridges 10 were the scene of the heaviest fighting, and that was because those bridges could support the weight of armor, and so the Germans really wanted those bridges. And the Americans really wanted those bridges. And so those were the 3 most contested bridges of the campaign. There were fights at other ones as well where German infantry was trying to get across, but the ones they really wanted could support the weight of German armor. And so that was really where the heaviest fight was located. That's where several Panthers rolled in and tried to push back the Americans. And so there was a back and forth, particularly at bridge 1 and 2. Once the sun set on March 24th was the scene of real bitter fighting along there. It was closer down into the vessel area, which had been plastered by several RAF raids over the previous nights. As you can see by this, vessel was a railroad hub. There was a number of depots there. There was a number of communication centers there. And so the 17th lost possession of bridges 1 and 2 at some point during the night. They counterattacked the next morning and took them back. And it was so bad at bridge 2 that the 194th was actually pushing their code clerks and admin personnel into the fight to push back the Germans on bridge 2.
Wow. But at this point, Jamie, there's been a couple of comments in the sidebar about the German reaction to this, because it seems maybe more fierce than the Allies were planning. But is this because, do you think, the German commander has this sense of how to combat an airborne landing, so he's throwing everything in immediately to try and end it quickly, but there isn't much strength in depth. So it seems really fierce. But unlike perhaps in Normandy, where they can keep putting other stuff in, once they've committed all that stuff, there isn't really much behind it. So it's kind of bark is worse than its bite in some ways. I'm not saying that dismissive of the people who lost their lives there, but did it seem to the that it was more of a reaction they were expecting?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think the answer to that depends on who you're asking, right? So let's pretend for a second that we're asking Montgomery or Ridgeway.
Yeah,
I would think that they would probably answer that it was more or less in line with what they were expecting. I think if you ask these guys at Bridge 1 and 2, Bridge 10, they'd have a different opinion on it, right? And I think that, to your point, I think it was, there was basically the remnants of two German divisions in this bridgehead area, right? Let's remember that those are not full strength divisions. So let's say that they're probably about 8,000 guys each, give or take. So, roughly equivalent to the number of troops that they were dropped in there, right? So if there were 16,000 Germans in two divisions, by my calculation, we brought in around 19,000, including the glider pilots who were armed and should be considered organized combatants as well. So, from that perspective, it was pretty even odds as far as by manpower count goes. And I think it was extremely violent in the opening hours because it was literally that. It was literally two divisions landing on top of two divisions, right? There's literally multiple accounts of guys getting in firefights through the roofs of the building. So the Germans are inside the building shooting at the roof, and the guys are landing on the roof shooting down into the building. And so, one way to describe it is the world's largest bar fight, right? So I think, but when you look out past that, right? So if you're Montgomery or you're Ridgeway and you're looking, okay, well, what do we got that's coming in? Well, those German armored reserves, the same thing that happened in Normandy, right? They're going to be hampered by the overwhelming Allied air superiority. So the guys on the ground have got to worry about tanks predominantly at night. The Germans have got to figure out how to move them from point A to point B without getting hammered by air power, which is hard to do, and which is exactly the same thing that happened with the armored reserves here, right? They were by and large stymied by the advanced planning and thinking of how they wanted to handle that from an air power perspective. The other thing that happened was the German Luftwaffe was basically completely knocked out of the fight before this even started. They spent like 3 days hammering German airfields. They were particularly worried about those airfields where the Me-262s were based. They were terrified that some of those jets would get into that giant armada and start taking out, transports and gliders. So again, I think that's another way to look at how the Germans knew to anticipate what was going to happen, was just the sheer volume of the Allied preparations kind of telegraphed in advance what the rough footprint of the size of the area was going to be. Did that answer your question, you think? Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Are we ready to move on? Yeah.
No? Yeah.
So Eisenhower in his memoirs described Operation Varsity as the most successful airborne operation of the war. And again, I think that's because it was a culmination of all the lessons previously learned. You used the word maverick at the beginning. There was no precedent before World War II to base learnings on, right? So these guys in a lot of cases were OJT, learning on the job, so to speak. And so Varsity kind of represents the culmination of that and just the air power that could be massed at that point. But it was a costly operation. The 17th Airborne Division lost just over 1,300 casualties in Operation Varsity. 430 of those were killed in action. The 6th Airborne lost a similar number of casualties. They had just over 1,000 casualties 1,000 casualties with 347 of their men killed in action. And that does not include the casualties of the glider pilots, the RAF air crews, the American air crews, and then of those B-24 bombers that came in, 109 air crew from those bombers was killed in that raid as well. So they got ripped pretty viciously. 16 of those bombers were shot down bringing in supplies, and they were so low that they just virtually had no way to pull out after getting hit.
But I mean, to put it into context, these aren't as high a casualty rates as Normandy or Market Garden. I mean, they're bad, but the extra precautions, the extra depth of getting the resupplies in by the B-24s is paying dividends. The extra, the experience, that you can absolutely see the progression of minor changes and major changes. I mean, it's incredible now. I mean, there have been commemorative jumps in Normandy happening for 10 times longer than Americans have been jumping out of aircraft at all by the time you were literally only jumping out of aircraft the first time 4 years earlier. And British, we were maybe a few months ahead of you. And now we're able to put together something like this with that amount of precision, that amount of aircraft in one space, with all these refinements, all these improvements. It's an absolute testament to the ability of these commanders. And I'm glad you're bringing people's characters to our understand that we don't know. We all know James Gavin and General Urquhart, but some of these names you mentioned tonight are less well known, and they absolutely should be better known. Which brings us back to the point at the beginning about why this operation seems to have fallen through the cracks. And it's we'll do some rounding. Anyone, if you've got any questions for James, now will be the time to kind of answer them. I couldn't. As we're getting busier on the sidebar in recent weeks, it's hard sometimes for me to keep up with all the questions and comments there, but now will be the good time to address them. But it's been absolutely fascinating. And in terms of we were doing our pre-chat yesterday about the book. This is a beginning of a work in progress for you. You feel that there's other airborne stories that need to be told, and I think it's absolutely to your credit that you're not just jumping into, hey, another book on Normandy, another book on Arnhem. And that doesn't mean that I don't want more books on Normandy and Arnhem, because I do. But I think there's definitely some value into looking into this as an example of just improvements of technology and improvements of method.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that. I hope that there are more books about Operation Varsity, to the point, I would love to swing back around and give the 6th Airborne their due. And I think as your channel is a testament to, every week there are so many great stories remaining to be told and to get their share of light. I think that I hope to continue to contribute to that. Yeah,
well, it as much as we like reading the same stories about the same things, and that, we've discussed this on World War II TV before. I think a lot of people, I'm kind of making it an example, they're going to get their book token of their 30 quid or their $40, and they go in their bookshop, and I think they often go in there thinking they want something new, and then they see another book on Arnhem or another book on the damn bus, and actually I think I'll get that. And it's I think we're not quite as adventurous as we should be in our reading. We look at things that, like with our music taste, like with our tastes in films, like with what we go to restaurants, we kind of, I'll try something, I'll have a burger. So we do kind of fall back on things. And I think Varsity is something that definitely needs more study. And so the 6th Airborne role, I think I've got 2 books on the 6th Airborne in Varsity compared to about 20 on Normandy. I know I live in Normandy, which kind of is my get out of my reason. But anyway, any questions coming in there? Well, that's good. But is it overlooked because the 82nd and the 101st were not involved? I think, and the answer is probably yes.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think that goes back to the fact that the 82nd and the 101st are still both active Army divisions, right? And so I think that they kind of, their legacy and tradition has kept on, right? Whereas the 17th didn't. And so, it might have been different if the 17th had been earlier in the war and gotten participated in Normandy, or it might have been different if the 17th survived the war as an active duty Army unit and continued to contribute to its history and legacy.
And even with the 507th, I mean, it's another potential rabbit hole, but the 507th, if you look at the Normandy campaign, like the 508th, Gavin, Ridgway, I don't think particularly like the 507th. It's all about the 505th and the few elements out of the 504th, the Pathfinders. And it seems to me that as soon as they get an excuse to get rid of the 507th, they do. I know they were not integral to the division. They were only ever attached to it. And that's what people get a bit confused with. There are the actual assigned to a division units, and then most of them actually are, even the 506th, which we all know about from Banner Brothers, actually only assigned to the 101st Airborne. They were only the 501st were officially part of the 101st Air. The others were just on attachment. But so the 507th history, and then George Millett, their commander, as we mentioned earlier, being captured, I think another kind of blot on their copybook there. RAF was controversial figure.
Yeah.
And
Well,
we're going to show folks on his D-Day, because his D-Day as a paratrooper, he was actually commanding that force of armored cars and half tracks landing on Utah Beach, trying to push in. And it came up in a show we were talking about a couple of days ago. I forget which one it came up in now, but it came up in something. So he's a potential candidate for a discussion as well. So yeah, there's lots of potential reasons why this doesn't get talked about. But you'd think with the British 6th Airborne, that would bring an interest. But even the British, we don't seem to. I think our interest really does kind of end with Market Garden. I think that's really what we're. I don't know why, but it does. But anyway, there's nothing else particularly. People just saying how much they enjoyed it, and I think that's probably the best time to leave it. So I'm going to remind people we've got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a moment. So folks, that was really good. I really enjoyed that. If my internet went a bit funny in the middle, it just 30 seconds. So my internet picture quality went weird, but no lasting damage. So tomorrow night we've got another live show. So Mike Bechtold, the Canadian historian, is joining us. So that's 6 o'clock UK time for a live show from the Manil Patri, which is an incredible battle, often referred to by Canadians as the Charge of the Light Brigade, the 1st Hussars, Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, moving over open wheat fields into a kind of rather heavily fortified 12th SS position. We've got some great photos of Sherman tanks knocked out. We're going to match you up, show the exact areas where these tanks came in, where they were hit. That'll be really cool. And then we've got Orador Serglan. Robert Pike is coming on to talk about the Silent Village, the victims of that terrible massacre by the Das Reich on, 77 years ago today. That was June the 10th. The show is on the 12th, so that's coming up. And then they just keep coming thick and fast, the shows. So keep checking what we're doing. Keep following us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Share the word with other people and consider becoming a patron. Of course, the link to James's website is in the description below. The link to buy his book is in the description below. If you buy it via bookstore, I make a small commission. So that would help me and James. And you'd get a good read as well. It's win-win-win there. So that's what's coming up. But right now, it remains for me to say, thank you very much, James, and I can absolutely promise you this is not going to be your first and last appearance on WW2 TV. You are coming back because you're very good at what you do, and your passion comes through, your knowledge, your superior knowledge about this, and we can do 11th Airborne. We can micro go in and look at this. We were saying before we went live, maybe next March we could go and have cameras in near one of the drop zones and follow one or other of the battalions or something and do it on the ground. That would be really cool. We'll think about that next year when we have easier movement post-COVID. Can we start saying post-COVID now? Can we start holding on to that thought? Yeah, post-COVID. Be fantastic. Right, James, have you enjoyed it? Was it good?
I did. This was great. I really enjoyed the opportunity. And again, thank you everybody who joined us live. I really appreciate it. And it's a privilege.
Well, it's a privilege to have people like yourself coming on. And so, I'm sure that the three people I met, the veterans I knew from the 507th, would be really pleased that there is now a really good book about this operation, because I do remember speaking to some of those guys and they were feeling they've been a little bit shafted by history, certainly in Normandy and certainly some of their later campaigns, because the attention goes elsewhere. So I think although they can't read it, at least their next of kin can read it, their grandkids can read it and get an idea about what their grandparents or their grandfathers did, because the 17th Airborne, really good unit. I still maintain, in terms of American units, the coolest divisional patch. I still think the Pegasus kind of sealed it, but I am British and I would say that. But yeah, the Golden Talons, great patch. So thank you very much, James, for watching. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget, keep in touch, as I say, and thank you for those who supported me recently on Patreon. It's very appreciated. And if you have been noticing the sidebar getting busier, it's because the YouTube algorithm does finally start to be working in my favor, which is rather exciting. So views are generally going up. So thank you everybody for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow. So don't forget, 6 o'clock UK time, Battle of Manil Patri, tanks, Shermans, wheat fields, 12th SS. It'll be a great show. Thanks everybody. See you next time.